talk about the Bolivian People's Cinema, a film movement that originated in the Latin American country Bolivia. Since 1524, this country had been under Spanish colonial rule, which ended in 1825. Bolivia emerged as a nation-state. However, this did not translate into the creation of a post-colonial democratic state. As a film movement, People's Cinema is situated within the socio-political and cultural reality of this country, which informed both the content as well as the cinematic language of the films produced. Now, once colonial rule ended, what happened was the power was transferred from the Spanish imperial crown to the local feudal class, who were basically the descendants of the white Spanish settlers. And they were referred to in Latin America as the Creoles. They, despite being the minority in terms of population, they had total control over both the economy as well as the political structure of the country. And the majority of the population were the indigenous people. But they, who had been continuously exploited and repressed throughout the colonial rule, continued to be persecuted. And this system was perpetuated by the white elite class, who treated the indigenous people with a very racist attitude. Despite the diversity within the indigenous communities in terms of culture and languages, they were all regarded as los indios, the Indians, and they were thought to be ignorant, to be inferior, while the government, through its policies, ensured that the condition of poverty and indignity of the Indians was a constant presence in Bolivian society. Thus, we see how the class structure in this society was determined predominantly by race. And the middle class within the Bolivian society were the mestizos, who were people with mixed race ancestry. The mestizos identified with the class interests of the elites, the whites, and they acted, or they played the role of middlemen in enacting upon the indigenous people the discriminatory and repressive policies of the white oligarchy, who basically controlled the most of the arable land in the country as well as the natural resources. Now, in the 20th century, we find Bolivian society under the neo-imperialist power of the United States government. The country, Bolivia, was very rich in, and still is, very rich in terms of natural resources. They had vast reserves of tin as well as natural gas. This was being exploited by North American corporations, and this exploitation was extreme, and this was ensured through the implementation of neoliberal policies, open markets, free trade, which simultaneously ensured that Bolivia as a nation could not develop its infrastructure, its industries. And this was something that the local oligarchy colluded with, this process, because they were amassing private fortunes in the process. Now, this lack of development in terms of the infrastructure was reflected in the lack of development of a film industry. In 1897, the first film screening took place in Bolivia, but we do not find a national film industry developing for a long time. Over a long period, films were made, isolated names do crop up, but these never contributed to the development of a national film movement. And what we find is instead that these films which were made were aimed at the elites, at the elite classes, and so the narratives would be told from the perspective of the minority. within the country, and so the indigenous characters would always be exoticized. And the language that they would use would always be Spanish, despite the fact that a great diversity in terms of languages existed in the country. Today, Bolivia recognizes 37 official languages, but Spanish was the predominant mode of expression, mode of speech in film, in cinema. Now, from its very initial phase, Bolivian people's cinema, which developed as a resistance cinema, as a form of resistance cinema, would be concerned with these issues, the issues of representation of the indigenous people, the issue of language. They would therefore have their narratives being told from the perspective of the indigenous people rather than from the perspective of the elites. They would use Quechua or Aymara as the language that is being spoken rather than Spanish. And so these are concerns that we find being aired in their films. Another factor, another cinematic influence that they were reacting against and resisting was that of Hollywood. Now, one of the reasons why the film industry did not develop in the country was the domination of Hollywood, which had total control over the national film market. And through Hollywood, the Bolivian audience was being exposed to a vision of modernity which did not connect or relate to the reality of Bolivian life. And so they were identifying with a vision that was not in any way connected to their experience. This was basically the way in which, through Hollywood, the capitalist vision of the imperialist intentions of United States was being disseminated. So Hollywood played a very important role in terms of cultural imperialism in Bolivia. This was another influence that the filmmakers engaged in the people's cinema movement would be reacting against. Jorge Sanquines, who is a leading figure within this movement, writes in his essay, "In Search for a People's Cinema," "A commercial US film is consistently expressing capitalist ideology without at all claiming to be the vehicle for awareness. A revolutionary film that projects the revolution in that same language will be selling its content and formally betraying its ideology." Hence, the search for a different cinematic expression. Now, how did the Bolivian people's cinema movement come into being, despite the lack of development of any kind of infrastructure? Now, the USA had a very strong control over the economy and the political structure, which was being aided by the CIA, economic and political advisors, as well as the military, which in Bolivia played a very important role in repressing all forms of mass movements. So there is a history of genocides and massacres throughout the 20th century that suppressed all forms of people's struggles. In 1952, in Bolivia, there took place a national revolution, and a government came into power who promised changes. They brought about three very important changes in Bolivian society. One was agrarian reforms and the nationalization of the mines. This was partially implemented, but even then it succeeded in bringing about considerable improvement in lives of the indigenous people. Secondly, they brought universal right to vote. Thus, the majority of the population, the indigenous people who had been excluded from the democratic process of the country, were now able to vote. And thirdly, they established a national film institute, the Bolivian Film Institute. And this film institute were primarily engaged in creating newsreels, documentaries, but the documentary work of Jorge Ruiz, who produced these very complex portrayals of the socio-cultural reality of Bolivian life, was a profound influence on the filmmakers associated with the People's Cinema movement. In fact, Oscar Soria, who was the scriptwriter for Ruiz, later on became an important part of the movement. In 1964, a CIA-sponsored military coup took over, and a military dictatorship was established of René Barrientos. Now, in its initial phases, the dictatorship tried to appear liberal, and they brought in Sanquines as the director of the Film Institute. Sanquines had, before becoming the director, had produced a single film, a short film titled Revolution, which was about the workers' resistance that had led to the 1952 National Revolution. During his tenure as the director of the institute, he produced two films. One was Aisa, which was the Quechua word for landslide, and the other was Ucamau, which was the Quechua word for as it is. Ucamau was very important in the fact that it emphasized on the reality in Bolivia where ethnicity determined social classes. Following the release of Ucamau, he was dismissed from his post. This was in 1967. And after his dismissal, he created, along with Oscar Soria, Ricardo Rada, and Antonio Eguino, the Ucamau Film Company, Ucamau Limited. The first film produced by Ucamau Limited was called Blood of the Condor, or Ivar Malku. This film was a manifestation of the theoretical basis of the People's Cinema movement. And the first thing about it was that it was based on an actual news report which said that indigenous women were being sterilized without them knowing by American doctors under the pretense of giving them medical treatment.
Chay centro maternidad pi kunantardeqa Martina Sapanaqa wañusqa.
Mana allin kachan kay centro maternidad pi.
Muyu runakuna willawanku. Hisq'un warmikuna chay centroman purerqanku kunantaq mana onqoq rikhuripunku. Chay supay onqoyqa tukuy ayllukunapiña. Imatachus koka willawasun chayta ruwasunchik.
Oka mama, kay suertita willariwayki, kay paktukuy ayllukunakuna kantarikuyku. Warmikunamanta, wawakunamanta, tirasqaminku kay awiman, mana allinchu, gringokunawanqa warmiwanqa uqllakanku. Kayqa sutin lluqsin, kay gringokunaqa wañuytan tarpurisanku, warmisninchikta wisamukupi, ari wañuyta tarpurisanku.
It received a very strong response from the urban audience. Students and workers led massive protests across La Paz, which is the capital of Bolivia, and they forced the two inquiry commissions being established, and ultimately this led to the expulsion of American Peace Corps volunteers from Bolivia.
Pero amigo, ¿qué pasa? Yo quiero saber qué pasa. Imaraico, ¿por qué nos hacen esto? What's happening? Stop.
Kay comunidad peca cantaka, daño iwa pejina, wañuchita, munsunkicha.
They seem to know everything.
Oh my God, Tom! What are they gonna do with us?
Shut up, Kathy. I'm trying to convince them.
Amara palanquicho, carajo. No carajo, ñao para hablar. Algumeta añinta castigación chel.
Mana, en Kitch. Yo explicar. Yo explicar.
Tell them! We only sterilized, but we have too many children!
These people.
Ang kuna wa yuchis tangkits. Kausau to armiko. Wisang kupi. Kikilantat ruaskaiku ang kunata nyokaiku.
You can't do this. No pueden. Ustedes no pueden hacer esto. Mi labor es científica. Mi embajada va a vengarme.
Ma'am, with respect to the blood of the condor, how does a film about sterilization and birth control comment on the USA imperialist intervention in Bolivian government?
It does so at two levels. One is, of course, at the level of metaphor, because it is showing how USA is influencing economic and political policies and daily life in Bolivia. But however, there is a more literal tone to it, and this for this I will quote something that Alfonso Gumucio Dagron said in his essay 3 Films by Jorge Sanquines. He says, birth control itself is only a way of referring from the particular to the general problematic of the daily intervention of North American imperialism in Latin America. The condemnation of birth control is real. It is no parable. To stop an underpopulated country from demographic growth is to condemn it to extinction, to weaken it, to shackle it to underdevelopment and slavery. Now, we must understand that in this film, the condemnation of birth control has nothing to do with Catholic morality, of course. However, what Sanquines and his team realized was that they had failed to connect with their intended audience, who were always the indigenous people. And this was because of a profound difference in the cultural view held by the indigenous people from the Western cultural view. And he realized that the urban spectators, like the filmmakers themselves, were also steeped in a certain Western theory of aesthetics, which failed to connect with the worldview of the indigenous communities. And he writes in his essay, Language and Popular Culture, the majority of our population are imbued in an Andean indigenous culture, Quechua Aymara. For this reason, we started to look for a cinematic language suitable for this culture. In this difficult operation, we had to start within ourselves, since we had been formed within the parameters of the dominant colonizing culture. And what was this difference? The primary difference, lay in the way in which the indigenous people imagined society. They imagined society not in terms of isolated individuals. Rather, it was the expression of a collective identity. And also, another factor was the way experience affected indigenous life. Experience was not something that affected the individual alone. It was something that the entire community was affected by, and so history was something that was lived collectively. And thus, in Blood of the Condor, what happened was he focused on the particular experience of a single family within the indigenous community, that of Ignacio and Paulina. Paulina being a woman who had been sterilized as part of this secret program. And through their particular experiences, a commentary was made on Bolivian society, on indigenous people, on American interventionism in Bolivian life. And this was something that did not relate to the indigenous way of thinking, worldview. So they started to change their cinematic language, their narrative technique. From the individual protagonist, we now see in his later films the emergence of a collective protagonist. And if we just compare the posters of the two films, Ivar Malcu, Blood of the Condor, and a later film, El Coraje del Pueblo, which was based on a massacre of miners carried out by the army in 1967, June 1967 during the nighttime festivities of the Night of San Juan, where miners were and their families were killed and then their bodies were disappeared. This film focuses on a collective experience, and not only a collective experience in terms of the fact that this group experienced this massacre collectively, but also the fact that through history, miners have been repressed through similar acts of genocide. So it's a historical identity as well.
A la pared. A la pared. Manos arriba. ¡Fuego!
What happened to the filmmakers associated with this movement was because of the fact that they identified film primarily in terms of its utility within a larger struggle for liberation. Film was a weapon for them in a medium to express radical revolutionary ideology. So they would be obviously persecuted by the government. In 1971, for instance, Sanquines had to go into exile. And therefore, what the filmmakers associated with this movement had to face was working not only under conditions of very limited resources, but also working under very difficult conditions in terms of the repression and the oppression meted out to them by the governments. And now what has happened to the People Cinema movement? Of course, Latin America and Bolivia is going through a period of great social transition with a socialist revolution taking over the continent. But the People Cinema movement has somehow decreased in terms of its radical charge, in terms of its revolutionary charge, and also in terms of its resources. it is in a Sanquines, for instance. His latest films have been sponsored by the government of Bolivia. So there is a transition that is taking place, and it would be interesting to note what new direction the film movement in Latin America and in Bolivia would take in the future.
Ma'am, how did exile affect the films produced by Sanquines?
Of course. He went into exile in 1971, but he realized that while he could not work with the indigenous people in Bolivia, the conditions that created the poverty and misery of the indigenous people were the same across Peru, Colombia or Ecuador. So he continued to make films here, and in his next film, for instance, El Enemigo Principal, the principal enemy, was made in Peru, and he used the Quechua Aymara oral tradition as a narrative technique in this film. Thank you.